1400 Texarkana, it's 5:20.
Here's the KTFS 2020 news for people with vision.
Artillery from the communist side has been pounding American positions south of the demilitarized zone between the two Vietnams. The firing that continued throughout the South Vietnamese voting killed 8 U.S. Marines and wounded 20.
The conflict in Vietnam, spurred on by the Gulf of Tonkin incident, is on its way to becoming a full-scale war. Small numbers of advisors become tens of thousands of fighting men as the nation continues to expand its involvement in a war few Americans understand. The U.S. intends to remain in Vietnam just long enough for the South Vietnamese government to organize and train its own military forces to stand under its own power. But as tensions mount, President Lyndon B. Johnson and his administration struggle to find the right level of involvement, hoping to contain the communist threat coming down from North Vietnam. As soldiers make landfall, 1965 is the year the Vietnam War truly begins. U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara visits South Vietnam in March 1964. But the 1963 coup and execution of South Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem has set off multiple failed attempts at military and civilian governments. The country's political instability creates a greater vulnerability, one exploited by the growing Viet Cong. The situation is dire. The country a powder keg, getting more and more agitated by the minute. In late 1964, the U.S. increases its air and naval forces in Southeast Asia. North Vietnamese Army troops move into position along the border of South Vietnam's central highlands.
In fact, I saw one night where some guys were shooting rockets at Quang Tri City down in the valley, and we sent some infantry guys down there, and then they come back, they couldn't find anybody, and a little bit later, you see the rockets going off again, so we shoot some artillery down there and get quiet for a little while, and then you see some more rockets going off. How are these guys surviving, you know? Then they brought the Cobras in, they brought tactical air in, they dropped bombs in that place, and then a little while later, you still see the rockets going off. Well, then we put a couple batteries of artillery on it and really shot. Probably cost a lot of money, but we got them.
U.S. troops will fight in an unusual war against an unusual enemy, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong. The North Vietnamese Army, or the NVA, began as a group of 31 men and 1 woman in 1944. They quickly grew into a formidable army, gaining concentration and troops as Vietnam separated into North and South. The U.S. supplies the South Vietnamese with weapons and armament. The North Vietnamese have China and the Soviet Union. While less equipped, the Viet Cong, the South Vietnam-based military branch of the Communist National Liberation Front, are no less formidable through their mastery of their local terrain and guerrilla tactics. The Viet Cong do possess uniformed soldiers, but it is the non-uniformed guerrillas who define the battlefields of South Vietnam. Many guerrillas are young teenagers. Some are idealistic, while others are shamed or pressured into joining. The average Viet Cong guerrilla, known as Charlie to U.S. troops, receives little training, but they are given a month of advanced training if promoted into a main unit. In 1965, Ho Chi Minh dictates a new way for the guerrillas to fight. Rather than attack American forces directly, they are to engage in hit-and-run attacks to wear the enemy down. But where do they run to? Strategically, Viet Cong have the hometown advantage, one that goes beyond their infiltration of South Vietnamese villages. Their inclusion of hidden underground tunnels and complexes allow them to literally pop up out of the ground, attack, and then disappear. On top of that, crude and effective homemade booby traps litter the South Vietnamese landscape. Villages that are secretly sympathetic to the Viet Cong require every villager to dig 3 feet a day. The addition of underground kitchens, sleeping quarters, and medical stations, as well as stores of food and weapons, means a Viet Cong soldier can survive underground for possibly weeks at a time. Many of the troops are armed with Chinese imitations of the Russian AK-47 submachine gun, as well as various Soviet and Chinese attack rifles, rocket-propelled grenades, and recoilless rifles. One of the first true assault rifles, the AK-47, was designed by a Soviet World War II veteran, modeled on the Nazi Sturmgewehr 44. A hybrid of other weapons, such as the M1 Garand and M1 carbine, the AK-47 combines the efficiency of these other weapons with the deadliness of its design. Less liable to jam than the M16 and easy to clean, the AK-47 becomes standard gear for the Viet Cong and NVA. The air war over Vietnam. American forces revel in their greater air power. On the ground, troops grow beyond the Cold War into the modern army of the 1960s.
I took my infantry training down at Fort Polk, Louisiana, and that was grueling, to say the least. Anybody who knows anything about Fort Polk will agree. Life was miserable there, pure hell, and I was pretty tough. All of us were by the time we graduated from infantry school there.
I went to Pensacola right after graduation, and I did pretty well all the way through. I ended up getting jets, which is what everybody wanted, and but the Navy has a lot more patrol pilots and helicopter pilots than it does tactical fighters, and so I had to work pretty hard. But I got them. A handful of the very senior instructors, the commanders, and some of the senior lieutenant commanders had flown in combat in Korea, but that was the end of 1952, and we hadn't had any real stuff happening until Vietnam started. They had the little things in Lebanon, and some other carriers were used for interdiction a few times, but there wasn't anything big. So nobody had any combat experience. We didn't even think about that. But that's what you're training for, so we kind of, you bring it on, we wanted to do it.
We went to Fort Sam Houston for basic training, where we got a uniform, learned to salute, that type of thing, and then orders for our next duty station. Just learned to march, to salute, pretend that we were in the military. When I was there were 300 nurses and 500 doctors, and the doctors were not happy about being there. They were like Hawkeyes in MASH. They had been drafted, and they were just doing their time.
Well, I got drafted in July 1967, and I went to Fort Dix, New Jersey.
I went to basic training in June of 1968. Went to Great Lakes Training Center in Illinois, and you went through your basic program of learning seamanship and things like that that was required at the time. It wasn't until after I finished boot camp that I got more training to go to Vietnam.
We had one man in our basic training who was an assistant cook that was very scary, and he was straight out of Deliverance, and I heard that sometime later he ended up stabbing somebody, and with the times that I was on KP, I never turned my back on him.
Standard issue weaponry at the start of the war is the M14, first put into service in July of 1959. Production delays keep American forces from being fully equipped with the M14 until July 1965. The early days of the Vietnam War will test the strengths and weaknesses of the rifle. The wooden stocks on early models swell with the jungle humidity, affecting accuracy. Automatic recoil is intense enough to make it uncontrollable in combat and impossible to aim. The length and weight of the rifle becomes burdensome in the thick brush of the jungles. Its replacement, authorized by Robert McNamara in 1966, is the M16. The lightweight rifle, coming in at 6 pounds, loaded, has a small caliber 5.56 NATO cartridge. What seemed shortcomings to many soldiers are actually equalizers, but field tests come up with a startling conclusion. 8 men armed with M16s carry the same level of firepower as an 11-man team with M14s. There are setbacks in the early days of the M16, however, ones that prove fatal. The apparently self-cleaning rifles jam in early field tests. The M16 also suffers from failure to extract, as dirt and corrosion from both gunpowder and oil cause cartridge casings to jam in the barrel and prevent further firing. The M16A1 is issued soon after, a model that corrects the fatal flaws of the M16. The chrome-lined chamber and bore, as well as the cleaning supplies included, help reduce failure to extract incidents and battlefield-related deaths. Heavier arms are also needed on the battlefield, which is where the M60 machine gun comes in. Known as the Pig for its sheer bulk, the belt-fed machine gun requires teams of 2 or more to operate it. Then there's the M79 grenade launcher, known as Thumper, and the Bloop tube for its distinct report. The M79 fires a diversity of 40mm rounds, be they explosive, smoke, or illumination. This highly accurate launcher has a range of 350 meters. The single-shot design, however, can be a drawback in battle. The fastest a grenadier can reload and fire is 6 rounds a minute. In close-quarters combat, grenadiers only have a pistol and knife to rely on, not an assault rifle like most of their enemies, and they are at a tactical disadvantage. The M203 grenade launcher attachment also comes out during the Vietnam War, allowing attachment to a variety of assault rifles. The M203 makes switching between both weapons effortless and streamlined for the GIs fighting in unpredictable fields of combat. As the U.S. increases airstrikes and prepares ground forces, the Viet Cong ratchet up operations as well, striking U.S. facilities and other locations frequented by Americans stationed in Vietnam, including bars and restaurants. By February 1965, there are 200 U.S. Air Force combat aircraft in South Vietnam. Another 200 are positioned on aircraft carriers in the Gulf of Tonkin. A helicopter facility, Camp Holloway, is stationed outside the city of Pleiku. It will be the site of a fierce attack. February 7th, 1965. It is after midnight when 300 Viet Cong soldiers converge on Camp Holloway with AK-47s. They mortar the airfield, destroying 10 aircraft and damaging another 15. 9 U.S. soldiers are killed and over 100 are wounded. Later that day, airstrike Operation Flaming Dart sends 49 sorties of U.S. F-105s to strike North Vietnamese Army bases near Dong Hoi. February 11, 1965. The Viet Cong retaliate with a bomb attack on the barracks in Quy Non. 23 U.S. are killed and 22 injured. President Johnson responds to this so-called continued aggression with Flaming Dart 2, doubling the sorties to 99 and including South Vietnamese fighters. Flaming Dart 1 and 2 are more than airstrikes. but acts intended to force diplomacy. Johnson and the rest of Washington wait for Hanoi's reaction, as well as Peking's and Moscow's. The hope is to reactivate the stillborn political process begun at the 1954 Geneva Conference between England and the Soviet Union. President Johnson is put in a precarious position. The American people, so soon after the Korean War, are likely reluctant to embark upon another land war in Asia. The hope is that air power will be just enough to contain the communist forces in North Vietnam until peace can be found. A major airstrike, like the Joint Chiefs of Staff proposes, would be more than the U.S. bargained for. The hope is for enough military action to force the North Vietnamese to negotiate towards peace, not a major action like the one proposed that can provoke China into taking an active role in the war. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara plans a gradually escalating air campaign, hoping the pressure from the bombing pushes North Vietnam toward a diplomatic solution. These carefully calibrated airstrikes are designed to be less likely to draw China into the conflict. The airstrikes will increase in strength in response to Viet Cong attacks in South Vietnam. Opposition in Washington fears the slow escalation will buy North Vietnam time to build its own air defense system. The White House only recommends measured and limited action, which is on display through Operation Rolling Thunder. March 2nd, 1965. As Operation Rolling Thunder begins, American and South Vietnamese losses are comparable to those in World War II and Korea. 9 U.S. and 2 South Vietnamese aircraft are shot down in the initial strikes, with another 7 U.S. and 34 South Vietnamese as the operation progresses. The North Vietnamese have a mere 35 Soviet fighters, both the MiG-15 and MiG-17. Unless China joins in with their 300 MiGs, they will remain overpowered in the air. U.S. air commanders are held back by regulations from higher up. All airstrikes require South Vietnam's participation against Washington-approved targets. Not only is napalm prohibited, but all unused ordnance must be dumped in the China Sea. Pilots, in attacking North Vietnamese vessels, must do their best to avoid hitting North Vietnamese non-military personnel. General Joseph H. Moore, commander of the 2nd Air Division, recalls early Rolling Thunder strikes.
I was never allowed in the early days to send a single airplane north without being told how many bombs I would have on it, how many airplanes were in the flight, and what time it would be over the target. And if we couldn't get there at that time for some reason, weather or whatnot, we couldn't put the strike on later. We had to cancel it and start over again.
Washington isn't the only obstacle to Rolling Thunder's success. By the start, the North Vietnamese amass over 1,000 heavy anti-aircraft guns. Many strikes are canceled or aborted due to the region's treacherous weather conditions for flying and lack of visibility from the dense foliage. Rolling Thunder is only intended to run for 8 weeks. It will continue for 3.5 years as the U.S. periodically calls off bombing with the hope that Hanoi will negotiate for peace. In charge of the U.S. Military Assistance Command in Vietnam, or the MACV, is General William Westmoreland. The general's ancestors fought in both the Revolutionary and Civil Wars, while he served in both World War II and Korea.
Well, you knew they were running the war. You had to play their game. You had to do what they wanted you to do. A lot of us always questioned, what are we doing here? Because, you know, there was too many regulations against us, a lot of things we couldn't do. It got to a point where we were only shooting so many rounds a day because there was an ammo shortage. And, you just had to be careful.
Another thing we thought was interesting was that if we got engaged with the enemy, you could use up the clips in your M16, but beyond that you couldn't fire anymore unless you had permission for it. And a lot of our commanding officers said they just didn't want to deal with that, so they'd tell you to keep firing. And when you got back to your home base, you have to fill out reports for your ammunition to resupply it. And they would compare the supply list against the orders, and they said, well, you didn't request to engage the enemy. And the commanding officer's answer was, well, we didn't engage the enemy, we had target practice, and there's no requirement of how much ammunition we can use for target practice.
Perhaps Westmoreland's greatest challenge is adapting his traditional approach to war to the unusual one that is fast becoming the Vietnam War. March 8th, 1965. General Westmoreland deploys boots on the ground for the first time when he sends the 9th Marine Expeditionary Brigade to a Da Nang airfield. At 3,500 strong, these combat troops are far from just military advisors. North Vietnam sees the move as an open declaration on not just themselves, but the entire Vietnamese people. To China, it is a grave move to further expand the war in Indochina. Engaging the enemy is not only probable, but now inevitable. President Johnson, forced to acknowledge escalation to war in Vietnam, must decide how to best move forth. The National Security Council, in April 1965, makes its recommendation to the President. The result is a National Security Action Memo, or NSAM 328. It is an attempt to please three differing views on the building war. There are those who desire a rapid move against the communists in Vietnam. Then there are those who oppose an increased U.S. presence in Vietnam. Finally, there are those who fall towards the middle and desire a stable presence without significant increase in U.S. involvement. The President's decision, embodied in NSAM 328 and issued on April 6th, is a turning point in both the war in Vietnam and American history. He sanctions a modest increase in U.S. ground troops in South Vietnam, 2 Marine battalions, and 1 Air Force squadron, plus support, and he alters the mission of the U.S. Marines from defense to more active use, or offense. This change ushers in the beginning of open U.S. ground warfare, a strategy strongly opposed by the Air Force. The President also authorizes 18,000 to 20,000 more support personnel. He steps up non-military assistance and United States Information Agency programs and further bombing of North Vietnam. Wary of a public backlash, President Johnson has NSAM 328 downplayed to avoid any change in America's policy on Vietnam. He is also dealing with civil strife back home as racial tensions mount in Alabama. On March 7, 1965, participants marching in support of voting rights legislations from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, are met with brutality by Alabama state troopers. Dismayed, President Johnson urges Congress on March 15th to pass comprehensive voting rights legislation to eliminate racial prejudice at polling centers.
It is the effort of American Negroes to secure for themselves the full blessings of American life. Their cause must be our cause too. Because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
Shortly after, the president must also address the escalation of the war in Vietnam, which will come in his Peace Without Conquest speech at Johns Hopkins University. April 7, 1965.
In recent months, attacks on South Vietnam were stepped up. Thus, it became necessary for us to increase our response and to make attacks by air. This is not a change of purpose. It is a change in what we believe that purpose requires. We do this in order to slow down aggression. We do this to increase the confidence of the brave people of South Vietnam who have bravely borne this brutal battle for so many years with so many casualties. And we do this to convince the leaders of North Vietnam and all who seek to share their conquest of a very simple fact. We will not be defeated. We hope that peace will come swiftly, but that is in the hands of others besides ourselves. And we must be prepared for a long, continued conflict. It will require patience as well as bravery, the will to endure as well as the will to resist.
Away from the microphone, Johnson allegedly tells his aides, "Old Ho can't turn that down." But Ho Chi Minh does turn him down. And the U.S. force in Vietnam continues to grow. By July, there are 125,000 troops. March 1965. John Paul Vann returns to South Vietnam for the first time in 3 years. When Vann was last there, it was as part of the U.S. MACV, commanded by Westmoreland's predecessor, General Paul Harkins. Entrenching himself in all aspects of the ground in South Vietnam, Vann quickly uncovered many truths, primarily the South Vietnamese's lack of will to fight their enemies.
The South Vietnamese Rangers were a very good cut of soldier, but for the general soldier, they didn't have the spirit that they should have, and when their country was being invaded from the north, I think they should have fought harder.
Witnessing the corruption of the Diem government and the military standstill against the Viet Cong, Vann makes it his mission to convey the truth about Vietnam to his superiors and the incompetency on display at the Battle of Ap Bac. Returning to America in April 1963, Vann's final report as a senior advisor uses inarguable statistics to show that the amount of enemy troops killed was actually 2/3 lesser than reality, with the MACV counting civilians killed as enemy troops. Unable to get a forum in Washington over his concerns and feeling stuck in a dead end, John Paul Vann left the Army in July 1963. His courage in talking to the media, particularly the New York Times reporter David Halberstam, brought attention to the government's shortcomings in the Vietnam War. Now, Vann is still determined to improve the situation in Vietnam, but this time as an official of the Agency for International Development, the U.S. government's agency for foreign civilian aid. He will be in it for the long haul. On 22nd February 1965, General William C. Westmoreland, USA Commander, U.S. Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, requested 2 Marine battalions to protect the key airbase at Da Nang from increasing threat by the Viet Cong to U.S. installations. In response, on the 8th of March, 1965, the 9th Marine Expeditionary Brigade, the MEB, landed at Da Nang. By the end of March, nearly 5,000 Marines were at Da Nang, including 2 infantry battalions, 2 helicopter squadrons, and supply and logistics units. In April, the U.S. government agreed to deploy still more Marines to Vietnam and to permit those at Da Nang to engage in counterinsurgency operations. The U.S. Marine Corps' new presence will be a strong one until war's end, and an incredibly welcome one by the South Vietnamese. It is March 8, 1965, when 3 ships, the USS Henrico, Union, and Vancouver, deliver the 9th Marine Expeditionary Brigade to a station north of Da Nang. When the first Marines land on Vietnamese soil at 8:15 a.m., they are in full battle gear and brandishing M14 assault rifles. They were not expecting the welcome that was awaiting them. 4 American GIs hold up a sign that says, "Welcome, gallant Marines," standing amongst the South Vietnamese officers and Vietnamese girls awaiting their arrival. This first deployment of Marines numbers 3,500. It is no wonder that they are eagerly invited to South Vietnam. The unforgiving environment requires soldiers capable of handling both land and sea fighting. The Marines will not only come in to fight, but also to build a stronger South Vietnam through the Combined Action Program. This effective counterinsurgency tool was used to combat the intense guerrilla warfare that U.S. forces faced, in addition to the traditional military fighting. Marine platoons are stationed in and around rural Vietnamese villages to provide training and security from Viet Cong belligerents for the people who lived there. The CAP, or CAP program, will go down as one of the few lasting and successful operations of the Vietnam War. It is estimated that none of the over 200 villages that were a part of this program were ever given over to Viet Cong control. But the Marines will see plenty of fighting, however, starting with Operation Starlight, an amphibious and air assault that will cement the Marine Corps' invaluable presence in the Vietnam War. The Marines at Vital Communications Base Chu Lai, under command of Lieutenant General Lewis W. Walt, receive intelligence from a Viet Cong defector that a VC regiment waits in hiding in the nearby village of Van Tuong. Lieutenant General Walt can wait for the Viet Cong to strike, or he can take the battle to them. Walt and his men have less than 3 days to plan the operation. It takes 2 nights at Da Nang's 3rd Marine Division headquarters of planning, 2 sleepless nights. But what they come up with is unprecedented in this young war. Operation Starlight will be the first fully American military operation in the Vietnam War. A hammer and anvil battle. The Marines will provide a hammer strike by the amphibious force landing on Green Beach, while Marines brought in by helicopter on 3 different landing zones will be the anvil upon which the VC are struck. They will push the Viet Cong between the 2 forces, crushing them. The beach is soon swarming with invading Marines, while the 3 LZs are met with descending copters, dispensing a company each. LZ White's company encounters some mortar and small arms fire, but they are able to push eastward. LZ Blue, however, is where the Marines of Hotel Company face opposition. It is located in direct line with the headquarters of the 60th Battalion, 1st VC Regiment. With 2 objectives, the nearby village of Nam Yen 3 and Hill 43, Commanding Officer Lieutenant Jenkins takes the aggressive stance of taking both at once. The Marines underestimate the Viet Cong's wiliness. Many huts in Nam Yen 3 are actually concealed bunkers, while the men at Hill 43 face off against a fortified Viet Cong force. Jenkins brings his men together, and with the help of arriving UH-1 Huey gunships and tanks from the amphibious force, Jenkins takes off for the hill and then heads towards Nam Yen 3. Captain Webb's India Company go after Viet Cong in the village of An Quang Tu, where Webb had to get permission to leave his designated area of attack. Once granted, his company is joined by M48 tanks from the beach. Unfortunately, a wide trench prevents tank movement in, leaving the Marine squad under command of Corporal O'Malley and Lance Corporal Chris Books to personally jump into the trench to attack VC soldiers. O'Malley keeps fighting the enemy, despite being wounded 3 times. The wounds fail to keep him from running into the battlefield to save wounded Marines. The remainder of India face off against the VC in the village, making short work of them. One Viet Cong, playing opossum, rolls back over and frags Captain Webb and other Marines with a grenade. Webb and 2 other Marines are killed in the explosion. Meanwhile, First Lieutenant Jenkins once more attempts to take Nam Yen 3, but he is almost flanked by an expertly camouflaged VC force. Lieutenant Corporal Ernie Wallace single-handedly goes after the VC with his M60 machine gun, eliminating 25 of the enemy. The Viet Cong presence at Nam Yen 3 is still too strong, and Jenkins' men are forced to withdraw back to LZ Blue after a high loss of life. Only 28 Marines are left in fighting form by the time they reach LZ Blue. A supply convoy en route to India Company is ambushed and trapped by the Viet Cong at noon. First Lieutenant Cochran, commanding officer, is killed, leaving Staff Sergeant Jack Marino to continue the fight well into the night. India Company join the battalion, and a second column is sent to assist the ambushed column, but it is soon driven back by enemy fire. Artillery and air support arrives, including F-4 fighter jets, dropping cluster bomb payloads. By nightfall, the Marines ready themselves in defensive positions, waiting for the enemy to strike once more. The Viet Cong, masters of the terrain, retreat under cover of dark, leaving behind over 600 dead. The United States Marine lose nearly 50 men, with around 200 wounded. 2 of their own, Corporal O'Malley and Lance Corporal Paul, receive the Medal of Honor for their action. President Lyndon B. Johnson presents O'Malley with his medal on December 6, 1966. O'Malley's citation reads as follows. Although 3 times wounded in this encounter and facing imminent death from a fanatic and determined enemy, he steadfastly refused evacuation and continued to cover his squad's boarding of the helicopters while, from an exposed position, he delivered fire against the enemy until his wounded men were evacuated. Only then, with his last mission accomplished, did he permit himself to be removed from the battlefield. By his valor, leadership, and courageous efforts in behalf of his comrades, he served as an inspiration to all who observed him and reflected the highest credit upon the Marine Corps and the United States Naval Service. On February 7, 1967, Lance Corporal Joe C. Paul receives his posthumous Medal of Honor. Corporal Paul, fully aware that his tactics would almost certainly result in serious injury or death to himself, chose to disregard his own safety and boldly dashed across the fire-swept rice paddies, placing himself between his wounded comrades and the enemy, and delivered effective suppressive fire with his automatic weapon in order to divert the attack long enough to allow the casualties to be evacuated. Although critically wounded during the course of the battle, he resolutely remained in his exposed position and continued to fire his rifle until he collapsed and was evacuated. By his fortitude and gallant spirit of self-sacrifice in the face of almost certain death, he saved the lives of several of his fellow Marines. His heroic actions served to inspire all who observed him and reflect the highest credit upon himself, the Marine Corps, and the United States Naval Service. He gallantly gave his life in the cause of freedom. November 14th, 1965. The first major conflict between the U.S. Army and the North Vietnamese will happen along the Drang River and be known as the Battle of Ia Drang. Most importantly, it will be a harsh lesson in the unforgiving terrain of Vietnam. The newly formed 1st Cavalry Division includes an old regiment, the 7th Cavalry. In times past, its most famous commander was General George Armstrong Custer. Their first battle may parallel Custer's own ignominious defeat. The 1st Cavalry is in hot pursuit of a North Vietnamese regiment retreating from the attempted destruction of a U.S. Special Forces camp. On this day, the 7th Cavalry Regiment's 1st Battalion find themselves in the Ia Drang Valley on a search and destroy mission. 16 helicopters shuttle Battalion Commander Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore's Bravo Company into landing zone X-ray on the northeast side of Chu Pong Mountain. They are to secure the area to prepare for the arrivals of Alpha, Charlie, and Delta companies. It will be a hard lesson in the unforgiving Vietnamese terrain. LZ X-ray looks deceptively flat and open from the air, but on the ground is a different matter. 5-foot-high elephant grass is perfect cover for enemy soldiers. Enormous anthills dot the area, large enough to cover weapons units. Colonel Moore is aware of NVA troops in the area, but not of the 3 regiments lurking nearby, ready to attack the outnumbered Bravo Company. It is an unarmed NVA deserter discovered by Bravo's 1st Platoon who reveals the bloodthirsty enemy lying in wait. Bravo intensifies their search as Alpha Company arrives to secure the LZ. Bravo's 1st Platoon does not search for long. Just after noon, they are flanked on both sides by an equally sized enemy force. Bravo's 2nd Platoon rushes to aid them. En route, they pursue a fleeing squad of enemy troops and are soon cut off from the rest of the platoon. Men in the platoon's 3rd squad spot 20 North Vietnamese scrambling to large anthills off their left flank. The 3rd opens fire. As they exchange fire, a U.S. grenadier finds the enemy range and pumps several grenade rounds into their position. A volley of enemy fire cuts into the platoon's right flank, killing the heroic grenadier and pinning the rest of the squad. With heavy enemy fire from all sides, the 3rd managed to reach the platoon's main body and form a tight perimeter. NVA fire kills 4 U.S. machine gunners, and then they use the fallen soldier's M60 against its own men. Bravo's trapped 2nd Platoon remains outnumbered, and the 1st and 3rd Platoons rush in to help. Will they arrive in time? Meanwhile, Alpha and part of Charlie companies land at 1330 hours. It is not a safe landing, as rounds of 60 and 81 millimeter mortar slam into the elephant grass in the LZ's center. Colonel Moore rushes an Alpha platoon to help the beleaguered Bravo amidst this chaos. Alpha Company, 2nd Platoon Leader, 2nd Lieutenant Walter J. Marm, bravely pushes his men forward in a skirmish from the hot LZ and towards the sound of enemy fire. His men meet up with a platoon from Bravo Company and continue on. They spot a force of khaki-clad NVA soldiers moving across their front from left to right. it is the same enemy troops that had separated the 2nd. Both sides incur casualties in the fierce firefight. The NVA troops break off and, unknown to Marm, are maneuvering behind him. Not wasting time, Marm gathers his wounded and sends a squad leader off to the LZ with them. The man returns shortly after. They are surrounded. Things are also grim for the others. Moore's battalion is at the receiving end of enemy artillery on LZ X-ray. The remaining Charlie and lead of Delta companies are only able to put down half their men because of the firefight. The remaining 8 choppers are ordered to stay away by Colonel Moore. The 2nd squad, still surrounded by NVA, suffer leadership losses as they are cut down in manpower. The 27-men squad loses 8 and suffer 12 wounded. Marm and his men get 100 yards from this lost platoon before machine gun fire comes at them from 30 yards ahead, stopping them in their tracks. Marm goes out into the open to pinpoint the enemy's exact location. Finding the bunker, he orders one of his men to fire a LAW, a light anti-tank weapon, into the anthill bunker. Affected by the humidity, the LAW misfires. Marm takes the LAW rocket, rearms it, and fires it into the enemy bunker himself. But it's not enough. The machine gun fire keeps coming. Marm rushes from cover to the anthill. Risking his own life, he hurls a grenade over the anthill. Several NVA soldiers are killed in the explosion. The remaining ones are killed by Marm and his M16. He signals his men to move forward. They leave cover to join him. Then, an NVA bullet meets its mark in Marm's lower jaw. A medic arrives and gets Marm back to the LZ. He flies off to base camp, having saved the mission and the lives of his men. Sergeant Ernie Savage, the 4th to assume command of the lost platoon, organizes a defense and calls precision artillery strikes in, ones that protect his men by driving the enemy back. They last throughout the night before units from both 1st and 2nd battalions join them the next day. For his actions that day, Sergeant Savage will receive the Distinguished Service Cross. Lieutenant Joe Marm receives the Medal of Honor for his bravery. Helicopter pilots, Major Bruce Crandall and Captain Ed Freeman, also receive the Medal of Honor for their flights in and out of X-ray, shuttling ammunition and supplies in and carrying wounded soldiers out. President George W. Bush grants Freeman his medal in 2001 and Crandall his in 2007. It is over 30 years since the actions that earned them.
Major Crandall flew the men back to base where the injuries could be treated. At that point, he had fulfilled his mission. But he knew that soldiers on the ground were outnumbered and low on ammunition. So Major Crandall decided to fly back into X-ray. He asked for a volunteer to join him. Captain Ed Freeman stepped forward. In their unarmed choppers, they flew through a cloud of smoke and a wave of bullets. They delivered desperately needed supplies. They carried out more of the wounded, even though medical evacuation was really not their mission. If Major Crandall had stopped here, he would have been a hero. But he didn't stop. He flew back into X-ray again and again. 14 times he flew into what they call the Valley of Death. He made those flights knowing that he faced what was later described as an almost unbelievably extreme risk to his life. Over the course of the day, Major Crandall had to fly 3 different choppers. 2 were damaged so badly they could not stay in the air. Yet he kept flying until every wounded man had been evacuated and every need of the battalion had been met. when they touched down on their last flight, Major Crandall and Captain Freeman had spent more than 14 hours in the air. They had evacuated some 70 wounded men. They had provided a lifeline that allowed the battalion to survive the day.
Captain Freeman's citation, decades after his heroic action. Captain Freeman's selfless acts of great valor, extraordinary perseverance, and intrepidity were far above and beyond the call of duty or mission, and set a superb example of leadership and courage for all his peers. Captain Freeman's extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty are in keeping with the highest traditions of military service and reflect great credit upon himself, his unit, and the United States Army. As for Crandall, his is no less sterling or any less long awaited. Major Crandall's voluntary decision to land under the most extreme fire instilled in the other pilots the will and spirit to continue to land their own aircraft, and in the ground forces, the realization that they would be resupplied and that friendly wounded would be promptly evacuated. This greatly enhanced morale and the will to fight at a critical time. His actions provided critical resupply of ammunition and evacuation of the wounded. Major Crandall's daring acts of bravery and courage in the face of an overwhelming and determined enemy are in keeping with the highest traditions of the military service and reflect great credit upon himself, his unit, and the United States Army. By the end of 1965, the U.S. military has 184,000 military personnel in South Vietnam. They are joined by South Vietnamese soldiers and combat troops from Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, and Thailand. These and other nations are legitimately concerned about the communist expansion into South Vietnam, at a time when so many countries have swiftly fallen to communism. The commitment of the U.S. to stand against the communist expansion and their inability to reach a diplomatic solution results in a war that will last another 10 years after the start of Rolling Thunder.